You are the most important person in town. You are the most important person in town. You hold your local society together. The men and women in your community who work every day to feed their families depend on you. Without you, people will go hungry, even homeless. There would be civil unrest, riots in the streets, if it wasn't for your constant routine. The very fabric of humanity is woven together by your hands. Can you believe all of this is because of bread?
Man, what an introduction. I mean, the man is right. Well, first of all, bread. It's not just a staple of so many cultures, so many nations, so many different, like it really is like a common denominator in a lot of different varieties and versions, but like from India to Europe to anywhere really, it's just made sometimes of different ingredients with different shapes and whatnot. But yeah, Africa, everywhere, like bread is literally everywhere, but it is ancient. I'll talk a bit more about that, but let's see how he's going, because now he's going the route with this presentation is going the route of the baker, of course, as the title suggests. I'll talk a little more about bread in itself as an invention when it comes to mankind and history, but let's see what else he's going to say. I loved the intro.
As a baker, you have a responsibility to your community to be able to bake this bread, bake it well, bake it to a certain standard. And in many situations, the baker took an oath in front of the community because this is the most important job in the world. Not just anyone can become a baker. You almost have to be born into the trade. Many people started off as an apprentice. And not just anyone can be an apprentice. You really have to be strong enough for this trade. You're carrying around heavy sacks of flour. You're carrying around huge baskets of bread in the streets to sell them. You start off young as a baker.
You know, if someone, I've got to check his comments, because if someone who is a baker is watching this must be like the greatest self-confidence boost. Like it really, I love that that a baker may be watching this, because bakers even today, of course, we are discussing now, I don't know, usually talks about like the 1700s, 1800s. I think that's mostly his focus. But when talking bread, we can go back to the ancient Romans. In fact, bread was ancient in ancient Rome. Like for the Romans, bread was already an ancient invention. It's really difficult to pinpoint it in time and say definitively bread was invented X thousand years ago. We can have some guesses. Ancient Romans and Greeks did have bread. Mesopotamians had bread. Akkadians had bread. The Egyptians had bread together with beer. Oftentimes they do develop together, because at the end of the day, I mean, bread in itself, it's not a complicated invention. It's the idea is we have these plants, we can't eat them. Well, we have a lot of these. What do? We'll destroy reduce them into a powder. Great. Can we eat that? Yes, but it sucks. So mix it with water. And then there is the addition of yeast, and that's why I'm saying it oftentimes works in conjunction with beer, because beer provides you with that yeast that then you can put there and then create bread the way we understand it. Flatbreads could also be created, of course. Very likely that they invented that one, maybe by accident. A lot of inventions happen by accident, or maybe because they knew what they were doing when it comes to the yeast. And it's interesting that beer oftentimes is regarded as liquid bread. It's another way to consume a plant that they had, most likely since the Neolithic period and the introduction of agriculture, for obvious reasons. I say most likely because it's possible that maybe some would be used in the wild before settled hunter-gatherers, but still. And you can really go as far back as who knows when.
Bakers in a community are part of a guild. So much so that they even turn out for parades, and they're all together and dressed all in the same way in a uniform. And in this guild situation, the bakers in the community have to compete against one another, but also support one another as they work within that community.
Yeah.
Why was the baker important? Why didn't people just bake bread at home?
Yeah, good luck without the oven. That's another big thing.
Everyone has an oven in their home. In fact, most people don't have an oven in their home, and they certainly can't afford to fire it every day. It takes a lot of fuel to fire up a little tiny oven. The baker has a huge oven. He has to start that oven up in the morning, but it bakes for the entire town.
And that's still similar to bakers today. They wake up at crazy hours and literally their lives are dedicated to it. I know that because we know this baker back in Sicily, and he wakes up like at 4 in the morning every day and then has to go in there, and you don't see him until 10 in the evening. And then I imagine he goes home and goes to bed immediately because he's probably tired. Rinse and repeat for like 30, 40 years. But then again, with this much sacrifice, and excellent bread, by the way, Sicilian bread is like, ooh, that level of sacrifice, he managed to send all of his daughters and children to university, to college, to school, and now they do, jobs that required a certain level of education. But I think it's impressive. I have a lot of gratitude towards bakers today. Even in this highly industrialized society, there still are very traditional jobs, one of which is this, that require a lot of sacrifice.
And not just bread, but people will bring other things to the baker to have them baked. You might bring a big cake. You might bring a whole haunch of venison. The customer is everyone in town, from the richest house to the poor house. And it's interesting that there's a loaf of bread that represents each level of society. Yes. Whether it's the most refined bread for the rich person's table or the coarsest dark loaf for the poor house.
Yep.
The reason why bread is so important is it's the one thing the everyday man can survive upon. And he doesn't need to cook it. He can just buy it and eat it, and that's it. That's all he really has to have. We will find journal entries where an author will talk about a meal that seems very complete, and he will complain about the lack of bread.
Sounds like an Italian. An Italian will complain about the lack of bread at every meal, lunch, dinner, anything. If there is no bread, the Italian is like, what? I can't eat now. You know what's interesting is that bread, if you really look at it, even though sometimes linguistically this can be a little deceiving, bread is everywhere. Because hardtack, that of course he has a video on, Max Miller has a video on, it's bread. It's just hard bread that is dehydrated and doesn't rise. It's still bread though. So hardtack, so bread was used in a different form to give it to sailors on top of ships, and to give it to the military, like the Romans had hardtack. And the reason why that was preferable, and even today, I mean, bread goes stale very quickly. So imagine if you are on the march or you're on a ship for months, you need to be able to carry your bread, but it should not get moldy and it should not get stale, and therefore it's very good to dehydrate it, and that makes it last for a lot longer. But that's still bread. Bread really has all sorts of variants, and pizza is a form of bread, right? We give it different names, but it's all bread.
That's how important it was. As the baker, you're required to bake 3 kinds of bread for the community. You bake a white bread, sometimes called fine bread.
Yep.
You bake a middling bread, and sometimes it's called middling or just wheaten bread. And then a low-class bread, a cheap bread, brown bread, and it was generally called household bread. Here's our fine wheat bread. This is the one everybody wants. And it's sort of a plain bread. You expect to put butter on this. It's not.
Depending on the area, could be butter or olive oil. I think butter was more common in Northern Europe, whereby